Sweet. All right. Thank you all for being here. My name's Maeve. I'm an organizer with the Minnesota Anti-War Committee. I almost said the Minnesota Abortion Action Committee because it's in my head because they're meeting below us. Thank you for joining the Minnesota Peace Action Committee tonight to learn about the weapons parts that are being manufactured in Minneapolis and how we can fight back against the presence of U.S. militarism in our communities. We're joined by a panel of Twin Cities organizers who collectively hold decades of experience fighting the U.S. war machine from within the belly of the beast. In addition to activists currently working on campaigns to impede Zio-American hegemony and combat violent U.S. intervention in Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela, we're also going to hear from two members of the original Honeywell Project, which I'm very, very, very excited about tonight. So just some brief context. In the 1960s, Honeywell was headquartered in Minneapolis, and it was the state's #1 war profiteer. Local organizers designed a campaign targeting Honeywell because the Minneapolis plant was producing anti-personnel fragmentation bombs that the US military was using to commit war crimes in Vietnam. In fact, a Vietnamese delegate confronted a McAllister chaplain at a conference in East Berlin to show him evidence of the damage caused by these munitions parts. He said, quote, "This is an anti-personnel fragmentation bomb dropped upon men, women, and children in North Vietnam. It was made by Honeywell in Minneapolis. Ask the people of your city why they have done this to us. We have done nothing to them." One of the project's founders, Marv Davidoff, used Cuban workers' councils as a model to outline the campaign's analytical framework, tactical approach, and anti-imperialist politics. He framed the struggle in terms of workers' control over Honeywell, and the Honeywell Project writ large prioritized organizing plant workers against the production of CBUs. They designed pamphlets, flyers, and educational materials for the specific audience of union members. I've got some of them, or some scans of some archival materials here that I'll distribute throughout the crowd, and you can kind of look at them over the course of the panel tonight. One of the most popular pamphlets featured the slogans, "Honeywell involved in genocide," "Honeywell products kill people," and "Honeywell profits from the suffering of others." Honeywell headquarters are no longer in Minnesota, but unfortunately all of these slogans still resonate today as the Minneapolis Honeywell plant enters into an exclusive contract with the Department of War to produce weapons components for use in American and Israeli war crimes. To tell us about this new contract and its implications, I'd like to introduce Lena Jabara from the Minnesota Anti-War Committee and also representing the Minnesota chapter of the U.S. Palestinian Community Network.
Hi, thank you all for being here today while we talk about Honeywell. So I'm gonna just do a quick overview of what does Honeywell do exactly, and if you look at their website, they'll tell you this sort of blah, blah, blah nonsense that's not really interesting. Kind of just painting a picture of we make things for your home and your office, you know, thermostats, air purifiers, alarms, etc. But that's according to Honeywell. According to their profits, you can see nearly 40% of the revenue from 2025 came from defense and space, and more than half of that came in the form of sales to the US government. And again, this is their data from 2025. So let's talk about Honeywell and the US Department of War, which I think is an awesome rename. It makes a lot of sense, and it's much more direct on what we're actually doing. So in March of this year, Honeywell reached a groundbreaking agreement to accelerate production of defense technologies where they are going to be receiving $500 million from the Department of War to help develop parts for a number of armaments. But specifically in Minneapolis, earlier in February, the Honeywell located right here in Minneapolis was awarded $30.8 million to assist the Department of War in the production of 1,890 advanced anti-radiation guided missile extended range inertial measurement units, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we can break down what that is in a sec. But first, I think it's really interesting to look at why this is so particular to us here in the Twin Cities, is because there is a very specific exclusivity to Minneapolis, to the degree that the Department of War cited statutory authority in deciding to go straight through Honeywell rather than doing their typical shopping around. And you can see on the right-hand side, they were stating that the commercial IMUs are available only from Honeywell, And efforts to complete and stand up a new source would result in a delay of approximately 45 months for the Argum ER production in particular. And the location in Minneapolis just happens to be the only location actually capable of producing these IMUs. So what is an IMU? I have the Wikipedia definition, which again is kind of like blah, 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 boring. But essentially, it's a device used to track motion. They're typically used in unarmed aerial vehicles, like drones, self-guided missiles, that sort of thing. They have accelerometers, gyroscopes, and magnetometers, and tools that just help these weapons that they're placed inside of make it to their destination. So some of the IMUs being produced in Minneapolis, we have the HG 1700, the HG 1930, the HG 5700, and the GG 1320. And you can see, well, you can't really see, but they're all produced here on 1433 Northeast Stinson Boulevard, again, right in our neck of the woods. So I thought that this was particularly jarring. You can kind of see it up here. It says Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is an IMU that was found after a home in Palestine was bombed in 2014. And looking at the fragments exposed that the IMU that was used in the bomb that was used was created in Minneapolis right here. And then on the right-hand side, you can't see the Minneapolis marking, but it is the same IMU part. And this time, this one was used just last summer when Israel bombed a United Nations school in Gaza's Nusra refugee camp, martyring over 40 Palestinians. So now we're going to get into the weapons that these IMUs are actually being used in. So first we have the ARGMs, which is what the contract was specifically for. And these are designed to be compatible with Boeing's FA-18E Super Hornet and EA-18G Growler, as well as Lockheed's F-35 Lightning II and the F-16 Fighting Falcon. And that they are advanced air-to-ground tactical missiles that are designed to attack air defense and radar systems. Yeah, so more on that. And then we have Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs, which take your typical unguided missiles and turn them into precision-guided munitions. Boeing's JDAMs, which Honeywell has been contracted to help produce in the past, they use the HG 1700 IMU, which again, they're produced right here in Minneapolis. And that same IMU model is also used in the production of Boeing's GBU-39 small diameter bombs. And this is another precision guided bomb that's GPS aided with the help of Honeywell's IMUs. And to top it off, these bombs are also compatible with the MQ-9 Reaper drone, which also uses Honeywell's parts. So these can be armed with missiles and are used extensively for surveillance. The drones are equipped with H764 embedded GPS inertial navigation system units, which is a Honeywell part that depends on another Honeywell part, the GG 1320, which is again produced here in Minneapolis. And then the last munition I'll be covering will be the Hellfire missiles. And while the exact IMU that Hellfire missiles are currently using is classified information, the MQ-9 drones that Honeywell helps produce are capable of being armed with them. And Honeywell has been contracted in the past to help support the Hellfire missile system by lending their HG 1930 IMUs, which are the IMUs that we saw earlier in the pictures from Gaza. So how are these weapons being used? This is not going to be an extensive list, and the list that I just ran through is also not a complete list. But we can cover some of them and get an idea of the extent that Honeywell is complicit in the US's war crimes across the world. So going back to ARGMs, while the AGM-88G is still being developed, that's the one that Honeywell is currently being contracted for, current iterations that also depend on IMUs have already been used extensively. For example, in Yemen against Ansar Allah, during Trump's illegal and ongoing war on Iran, and earlier this year during the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores, remnants of a missile in the AGM-88 series struck a civilian apartment complex and resulted in the murder of 79-year-old Rosa Gonzalez and the wounding of several other civilians. So now JBU 39s and JDAMs. GBUs have been described as the Israeli military's weapon of choice. They've been used extensively throughout the genocide in Gaza, as well as to murder Palestinians, Lebanese, and Yemenis outside of Gaza. So there are a lot of examples here, but I think that the important takeaway is that these munitions and armaments being described as precision munitions because of their dependence on the IMU doesn't mean anything. At the end of the day, they're just being used to precisely strike civilian infrastructure and murder people across the world. And then we have MQ-9 Reaper drones, and I couldn't help myself. I think that they're really fun to see in the news because Yemen cannot stop downing them. But they also are able to be armed with missiles and have been used extensively for surveillance. Up here, there's a screenshot from the New York Times, an article that came out in April, talking about how the US has been using them extensively across South America in conjunction with the illegal and inhumane boat strikes that have been conducted across the Caribbean Sea and Eastern Pacific Ocean. We have some in Okinawa for some reason, and yeah, we're using a lot of them throughout the Middle East right now. And lastly, there are Hellfire missiles. They've been dropped also extensively in Gaza during this ongoing genocide, used in the war in Iran, where CENTCOM recently used two to bomb a Panama-flagged vessel trying to transit through the Gulf of Oman. And they're also a go-to for the U.S. Africa Command, and have been used extensively in Somalia. There's a really great article also linked up here about how, the collateral damage. They're precision munitions that are still hurting civilians. All right, and I'm closing off with a slide titled, "Uh-oh." That's implications I will leave up to all of you. These are several headlines from just the last couple weeks, and there are numerous more that you can look into, detailing how the US is running extremely low on many of their munitions due to the war in Iran. But these shortages specifically include precision-guided weapons, which all depend on IMUs. And we know disruption to Honeywell's IMU production would be disastrous because, again, the location in Minneapolis is the only one capable of producing them. But with increased shortages, we really are particularly positioned in Minneapolis to affect the ability to which the US and Israel are able to actually create these munitions and carry out these crimes against humanity. And then, I'm not clicking the right spot. This is a link to the slides if you'd like to look at them in the sources, because it's meaty. But that will be all from me.
Just gonna go down to Amber. Can we get another round of applause for Lena? I would really highly recommend that everyone either type this bit.ly in or take a picture right now, because all of Lena's sources are cited on the slides. And so if there's something you heard, maybe about AFRICOM, maybe about like the specific logistics of IMUs that you want to learn more about, you can look at the presentation and you can follow the citations and get as obsessed with this as we have been the last few weeks. I also want to thank Lena for pronouncing all of those component and missile names so I didn't have to. Our next speaker is an incredible organizer with About Face, Veterans Against the War. We're going to be hearing from Amber about some of the specific military implications of all of this Honeywell bullshit that we're talking about today. Can we give it up for Amber?
Thanks everyone for coming tonight, and maybe a fourth round of applause for Lena. Because when I opened up the slide deck, I was like, holy shit. This is thorough and really makes a direct connection that is otherwise very complicated and convoluted, because it's a very important single part, right? In a missile or a drone or whatever, amongst many parts going to one contractor to build them all together. And that is an incredibly complicated thing to follow sometimes. And I want to say I was in the Navy for 10 years, and I'm not a subject matter expert in this, but I am a subject matter expert in the Navy being stupid. And so a couple of things that I wanted to add to this conversation is, while I was looking for some data, Honeywell also brags about making their IMUs, but they do not include weapons of war in what they are bragging about. So behind the scenes, these unseen positioning sensors will keep making manufacturing more efficient, help farmers optimize crop yields, keep your airliner on course, and enhance everyday life. And I really have to challenge that last one about enhancing everyday life when we're like literally killing with these machines. And so I'm a Teamster, and these are I don't know about applauding quite yet. These are manufactured by unionized labor, Teamsters specifically here in Minneapolis. And I think that's always a really important aspect of challenging the military-industrial complex, because so much of our actually unionized labor is within the MIC, right? And so there's challenges there in pointing out to people like, hey, your lifestyle, your good union benefits come at this huge expense to cost of life around the globe. And that is one thing that I think about FACE has been uniquely positioned to talk about, is people, you know, from those who, like myself, had a progression of change of thought to those who, you know, were like, holy shit, what we're doing is wrong, and I'm going to disrupt my entire life right now and take whatever repercussions come my way for saying no. And that's really kind of what we need to get some of the unionized labor to be able to do, because they can't make those products without those people. In that this IMU production with Honeywell, based on their timeline, started maybe late 80s, early 90s. And that one of the first strikes that they may have possibly been involved in, and I'm always going to say this wrong, is going to be the Amiraya shelter bombing in Baghdad, Iraq on February 13th of 1991, which killed 408 people. And once again, they claimed that they just were told that it was another, you know, location, and that they didn't intend to kill this bunker that was full of civilians that had only ever been used for civilian protection during this time frame. It was used during the 2003 invasion in Iraq. Interestingly enough, these may have also been used in the bombing of the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory on 20th of August, 1998, which is one of the more, what's the word I'm looking for here? Was part of the reason leading up to September 11, 2001, right? A pretty significant one, because bombing that pharmaceutical factory took out the capacity to provide necessary pharmaceuticals for hundreds of thousands of people. And that is part of that count that we need to consider of, you know, it's direct warfare, but it wasn't the impact continued for years afterwards. In that this most recent IMU testing was conducted at Point Mugu off of the California coast, and so that's a significant environmental concern that I know all of us are concerned about as well. And and I'm not going to speak very long today, but that one of the things that really stuck out to me when looking at the slides that Lena put together was that these are currently being launched off of the USS Abraham Lincoln, which, if you paid attention to the news the last 48 hours, whether there was a mutiny or whether sailors are trying to jump overboard because they are absolutely at their wits' end with what they've been doing and what they're experiencing right now, is that I'm not asking for sympathy for them at all. As one member of our organization said, maybe a little bit of hunger will get them to question their life choices. But that it really does show how desperate the military is right now, because they can't keep up with what's being pushed back at them, and that you also cannot carry out preciseness that these machines supposedly have, machines that are at the end of the day run by humans that may be as young as 18, 19 years old, if you're hungry and suicidal, and if you're suicidal, you may actually be homicidal. And I'm saying that knowing this is going to go on the internet. And yeah, the possibility that Minneapolis and Minnesota could once again push back in such a significant way and disrupt that supply chain is amazing. And I'm really excited to hear about the legacy and how we can build on that going forward.
Thank you so much, Amber. It is now my pleasure and honor to introduce a legend of Twin Cities organizing, a member of Women Against Military Madness, a member of the Honeywell Project, part one. Hopefully there will be a part two very soon, who is going to tell us about some of the things you might be reading about in the archival materials that are circulating right now. Can we give it up for Sarah Martin?
Okay, all right. You heard me, thank you. All right. This is, of course, this is the latest chapter in Honeywell making money off of genocide and war crimes. It's a long history, but so is the opposition they have faced, which began, and this began in 1968. You heard a little bit about that at the height of the Vietnam War. A national call went out for local anti-war groups to target weapons manufacturers in their communities. Some things don't change, do they? Here in Minneapolis, Marv Davidoff, full-time activist, knew the target had to be Honeywell. It was the largest weapon manufacturer in Minnesota, one of the top 20 in the country, and the corporate headquarters were here. And they made cluster bombs. These hideous weapons were dropped from planes, and when they exploded in midair, hundreds, maybe thousands of little bomblets, as they were called, flew out. They didn't really destroy property, but they were meant to kill and maim civilians, and that they did. 90 million were dropped over Southeast Asia during that war, and they many of them did not, 10% did not explode. So for years, people, farmers, children, people out in the fields in Laos and other countries stepped on these things, and so the killing and the maiming continued. Now Marv, who knew Marv? Who's old enough to marry? He was charismatic, to say the least. Determined, the pictures of him you can see, he sort of was like he looks. Very visible, well-known, and a very colorful leader. Activism was his life, lucky for us. On December 4th, 1968, he called together 25, in response to this call, he called together 25 members of several orgs here in the Twin Cities, including SDS, the first SDS, and the Progressive Labor Party, to take on a sustained campaign against Honeywell. They met weekly and did the research, and after 4 months, they went public. Massive leafleting campaign, demonstrated and hung banners outside Honeywell execs' homes. They actually met with the CEO, James Binger, many times, hoping, or no, I'm not sure they understood, they never talked him into it, but calling on him to stop making weapons and go back to making thermostats. You know what his answer was? It was no. The first major high-profile action, and this was Honeywell Project number 1, actually. Cindy and I were not involved with this. We started in Honeywell number 2. Honeywell Action number 2. The first major high-profile action was at a shareholders meeting. A member of the project who had shares in the company actually got up and spoke for 10 minutes against these bombs. This was followed by large-scale leafleting in the plants and demonstration outside corporate headquarters. It was hard. It was very hard to make contact with employees, but at one point, the recording secretary of the Teamsters did reach out to the project. She lost her job because of that. The project grew with the devastation of the war. A year later, they held a much bigger demo at the shareholders meeting, and leading up to that, they had a big proxy campaign, and they collected proxy votes from sympathetic shareholders and institutions to be used in vote to end the production of cluster bombs. Marv went on a national tour calling for demos across the country, and I think there were 140 that day. Lots of national groups responded and publicized the event, including the Panthers. The night before, there was a big rally. Before any of the big actions, that became the thing, big rallies with big names. And who knows Jerry Rubin? Anybody heard of Jerry Rubin? No. He was part of the Chicago 8, tried at the time of the, do you know that? The Democrat National. Anyway, he was here, kind of crazy guy, but he came and spoke. In fact, he said he called on Honeywell to go back to making honey. Yeah. The day of the meeting, the next day, the press coverage was incredible. All the print and TV was there and actually covered it. They had a march. They got permits in those days, but were not given a permit, so they stayed on the sidewalk and walked from the Art Institute to Honeywell headquarters, which was several blocks. 830 proxy holders were let in, and there were 3,000 people outside. But soon all hell broke loose. People began breaking windows and clashed with the cops. Years later, in a trial against the FBI, it came out that this was a COINTELPRO operation. And because of that, Honeywell was awarded $70,000 in the settlement. When the U.S. lost the Vietnam War in 1975, interest in Honeywell and cluster bombs fell, and the project had a hiatus until 1980. This is the next chapter when we were involved, and I became involved too. Cindy was an important organizer. I was just a soldier, I'll make that clear. What started was when Reagan was elected, and he started talking about how the U.S. could actually win a nuclear war. That terrified any conscious, sane person and ignited the anti-nuclear movement both here and in Europe. U.S. nuclear missiles were being sent to Europe to be put on bases, and Europeans weren't having it. They had huge demonstrations. Now, Honeywell made guidance systems for these weapons, so once again, they became the target. At this time, the St. Joseph Sisters, including the kick-ass 4 McDonald sisters, began holding vigils once a week at the Honeywell headquarters. They were following the plowshares actions, which had been taken up by radical Catholic pacifists, anti-war priests and nuns and parishioners, including 2 priests who grew up on the range, the Berrigan brothers. Using a passage in the Bible which calls for pounding weapons into plowshares, these activists would go into factories where the missiles were being made and pound on them with hammers, damage them, pour their blood over them, and wait to be arrested. And they spent, ultimately, many of them, many years in jail, of course, but went back time and time again through the years. Let's see here. The Honeywell headquarters was blocks from the house the sisters ran for the unhoused women, and it's where Marv and others from Honeywell Project began to meet. The money for human needs, not for war, obviously, has always been a thing. This group grew quickly, too. The strategy they chose was civil disobedience. 2 big actions a year blocking the front door of the Honeywell headquarters, then using the courts and trials which happened was also part of the strategy. This was, of course, for publicity, to educate jurors, and also to clog up the system, which they did. We did, not they, we. October 8, 1983 was the biggest of all the rest. 575 people arrested. People formed a chain around the headquarters. It was closed down for the day. Actually, these protests closed the headquarters down several times. This obviously got it got national media coverage, both because of the size, but also because of an interesting thing here in Minneapolis, the Bozas. Erica Boza was a member of WAMM, and Tony, her husband, was the chief of police. He was every bit as charismatic as Marv, and actually they became friends. When we were arrested, we were taken to the convention center in buses and given donuts and coffee, which he actually brought out of his own pocket. In between the big actions were smaller ones. Affinity groups planned many of these. I was arrested several times, acquitted by a jury once, charges dropped by a judge once, and got community service several times. One of the times we put on a conference for the day about the effects of nuclear war, or the prospect of nuclear war on children, and brought in speakers. So that was our community service. Finally, to deal with the court backlog, and it was huge, prosecutors began to drop charges to petty misdemeanors like they do today. The judges actually dropped charges before trials, and in bench trials, acquitted people on technicalities. Over the 7 years these actions happened, there were 2,200 arrests, 100 trials, but 70% were convicted, of course. These actions happened from 1980 to 87, and then when Gorbachev and Reagan signed a nuclear arms treaty, once again public attention and press coverage dwindled. Then in 1990, Honeywell actually went through some hard times. There were layoffs, they were involved in scandals with cost overruns, and of course all the bad publicity from the Honeywell Project campaigns. Honeywell's image had plummeted, and they were now better known for making terrible bombs, not thermostats. So as a result, they spun off another company called Alliant Tech Systems, and they got many of the weapons, including the cluster bombs, and as it turned out, landmines. They moved to Hopkins. In the meantime, Honeywell Project became an organization called MIST, which was to educate and train activists. And then 5 years later, Marv was approached by an organizer with a growing movement to ban landmines, which were causing so much death and injury to innocent civilians around the world. Alliant Tech was, of course, a major manufacturer of landmines. It was an obvious target. The Honeywell Project became Alliant Action, that was the name, with some of the old Honeywell Project people, including the St. Joseph Sisters, the Ford McDonald's, as well as new people. Using the same strategy and tactics, weekly demos as well as larger CDs at Alliant's front door. But in this case, we had a victory. The landmines were actually banned, although the U.S. has never signed the treaty. Because Alliant also made delivery systems for First Strike Trident II nuclear missiles and depleted uranium munitions, Alliant Action continued to hold them to account until they were forced to move to Arlington, Virginia in 2015. And this was after 798 demos consecutively in front of Alliant Tech on Wednesdays over the years. Honeywell may have moved its corporate headquarters to New Jersey in 1999, but it continues to make weapons here in our community. And we say, hell no to that, Honeywell.
This is everything I wanted it to be and more. Our final speaker is going to be Cindy Dahl, who is also a member of the Honeywell Project 2.0 and not just a soldier, is what I'm hearing from Sarah. Can we give it up for Cindy?
So I want to apologize in advance for thinking this would be a snap to prepare for. I wish I would have gone through my basement and found photographs and actual court statements and articles, and I wish I would have contacted more people who I became so close to in that day. Nevertheless, this is what I have. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thanks for Sarah for inviting me to share some of my experiences as part of the Honeywell Project in the 1980s and 90s. In 1981, I attended a talk by Marvin Davidoff at the St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church as a part of their Peace and Justice Action Committee. He talked about his life and involvement in civil rights, anti-war and anti-nuclear movements, and the Honeywell Project, which was active during the Vietnam War. He then talked about Honeywell's continued production of weapons and guidance systems, including the cluster bomb. Little did I know I would wholeheartedly dive into and become part of the revival of the Honeywell Project. A bit about myself. I grew up in a middle-class family, with a liberal family. My mom worked as a nurse anesthetist and was part of an organization that lobbied for the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s. My dad was a mail carrier involved in his union. My first foray into protesting was in my senior year of high school, and a group of us decided we'd had enough of the dress code, which prevented women from wearing pants and everybody from wearing blue jeans. So flags were made using deconstructed jeans in my parents' basement and garage, and along with signs and chants, a walkout was executed as we walked around the building, and many more students joined us. My dad accompanied me to the principal's office the next day and gave his support of my actions. I was suspended for 3 days, spent most of the time at the beach, and the next school year, the dress code was changed to meet our demands. So I am a retired and still a member of the Minnesota Nurses Association, which was instrumental at the time in the largest nursing strike in the nation in 1984, with 6,000 of us on the picket lines for 7 weeks. And I continued my work as a union steward in negotiation for the next 43 years. So Sarah has outlined the history of the Honeywell Project movement and the international and national protests and organizations locally. And I'd like to speak about my personal involvement, which concerned more of the behind-the-scenes, day-to-day actions that every organization deals with. Because of Marv's talks, I began attending and learning sessions with Marv and other local activists at the St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church. I even got to speak in one of the Sunday homilies, and my subject was Jesus as a revolutionary. I have that speech somewhere. It was pretty dang good. I started to attend the weekly vigils at the war headquarters, and I got to know the people and the workings of the peace and justice community in the Twin Cities. In particular, the Sisters of St. Joseph and the 4 McDonald's sisters, who are also nuns. Look them up, they're fabulous. And their community on Franklin and Portland, the Hope community, and it's still there today. As I learned about Honeywell's weapons business, and as the Honeywell Project became more organized, we designed and produced leaflets to distribute to the employees. I especially liked showing up at the entrance to the underground parking on 5th and 28th, where the executives drove in. I loved standing in front of the Cadillacs and saying, "You need to read this." They weren't very receptive. As I became familiar with a cluster bomb, which I have part of one here, and learned how horrifying these things were, there were like 2,000 to 3,000 loaded into a shell, which was then dropped from an airplane, and at an assigned altitude would break apart, and these would spin out in all kinds of directions and land on the ground, hopefully bouncing up and exploding about 3 or 4 feet off the ground with I don't know how many babies are in here, and hot metal. They were called anti-personnel weapons. They weren't for defense. They were to kill soldiers on the ground. And what did you say? 900 million of these were dropped in, 90 million were dropped in Southeast Asia during the war. And to Honeywell's admission, up to 10% did not explode and were left in the ground where farmers and civilians would step on them throughout the years and blow themselves up. It became clear that vigils and leaflets weren't enough to stop the production of these weapons. So there was a growing national protests and actions as the U.S. prepared to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles loaded with nuclear weapons to Eastern Europe, Western Europe. That was a catalyst. Plus, the CEO of Honeywell, Edson Spencer, kept saying that they can stand there until hell freezes over, and we don't care because they're not causing any trouble. And then the Washington Post broke a story about Honeywell cluster bombs used in Lebanon by the Israelis, citing reports of civilians being maimed and killed. And by the fall of 1982, the Honeywell Project decided to mount their first large protest action at the headquarters. In conjunction with the world premiere in Minneapolis of the docudrama about the trial of the Plowshares 8 Catholic resistors entering the King of Prussia factory and damaging missiles and pouring their bloods on the missiles. Daniel Berrigan, one of these, and was here, as was Martin Sheen, who played the judge in that trial. This was big. This was a big deal. I was involved in. Thus began a massive prep for this event in action. We had the support of many peace and justice groups around the state, and our affinity group set up meetings by phone trees. Remember phones? And began training in nonviolent actions. We were supported by many groups around the country who had experience in nonviolence trainings, and I was trained, and I led many of this, and I've led hundreds of them over the years. And I and another person had done reconnaissance of the building, and we had because of one of my dad's friends who worked at the Star Tribune, had this big roll of white paper that we rolled out, and I drew the whole the building and where the doors were, where the cameras were, and we planned our action. We were going to shut down the Honeywell the bomb factory. We had a weekend retreat where we participated in role playing, taking the roles of we played protesters and police and observers and employees and the media, and we would act out what we were going to do, and we each took turns playing the other, and that was really instrumental in cementing our nonviolent behavior. The day after the first showing of the film of the two-day action began with Martin Sheen and Dan Berrigan. Local media captured the winter-clad protesters, and it was really cold and glooming. And the second day, we added more people who actually blocked the entrances. Of course, Honeywell called the police and said these people are on our property. We were arrested. The first trial found us guilty, and we had to pay fines or do community services. Our judge was a young man called Michael Davis, and it was his first criminal trial. In April 1983, the second much larger action, about 2,000 people showed up, and that was quite the organization. I was part of committees that talked to the media, went and tried to talk to our legislature, our community, community organizers, our city council, and of the 36 of us who pled not guilty in that action, a trial was held. After being allowed to present the imminent danger defense and very much emotional testimony by a mother with 2 kids, a Vietnam vet, we were found not guilty. And I'm going to read the statement from the foreperson of that trial. She said, I was awed by people's total commitment. I gave them a lot of credit for standing by their beliefs. Unfortunately, that was our only not guilty. I can't remember how many times I'd been arrested at Honeywell. I spent a Thursday through Monday in the workhouse one time. I was supposed to get out on a Friday, but you know, it's the jail, and I had to call in sick to work from the jail, where my supervisor just kind of laughed. Thus began the years of direct, nonviolent actions at the Honeywell headquarters. That first one in November was a first for most of us in many ways. We decided to risk arrest, being handcuffed. We decided to go to court, facing a judge and jury. We decided to go to jail, along with other convicted criminals. We decided to have crimes on our records. We decided to risk family disdain, being fired from our jobs, shunned by neighbors. But most of all, we were tasked with explaining our beliefs and our motives for our actions, which really, really resonated with a lot of us. Being part of the Honeywell Project for me meant a great deal of learning about weapons, about the history of war, about protest movements, about government involvement in war, at home and abroad. During those first major actions, I learned about nonviolent tactics. I led nonviolence trainings. I got proxies to the shareholders' meetings. My friend Mary Swenson and I would show up in our office gear, walk in and walk up and walk up to the front and shout, "We are arresting all of you in the name of peace and justice." I learned how to talk to my city council representatives, the police, my employer, my family. And as Marv often stated, the personal became political. My personal life became part of my political life. Being in this large group brought arguments about philosophy, tactics, and direction. But the experiences, people, and exposure to public and private systems, organizations has been life-changing and far-reaching. I am fortunate to live in a safe and vibrant community in South Minneapolis right now who came together to support our neighbors during the ICE invasion. The work continues.
I don't think that was enough. Can we? We're going to transition into a question and answer section. I know there are a lot of stories that you've referenced briefly that I want to hear a lot more about, and I'm guessing a lot of you have had the same feelings. So if you've got a question, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. I'm going to call on you. You're going to say it. I'm going to repeat the question to make sure it gets picked up on the mic. And please be sure to direct your question to a specific person if it is toward a specific person. I almost want to ask who doesn't have a question, because I feel like the number of people who do should be the majority of the people in this room. Who wants to start us off? Wyatt.
My question is for the two Honeywell Project folks. And I apologize, I stepped out briefly, so maybe you talked about this, but many of us are used to mostly using social media to promote activism, and lately that hasn't been working so well, and it seems like there's censorship potentially happening. And I think Sarah, you did mention like leafleting and stuff, but I just wonder, how did you get the word out to people? Because it sounds like you successfully did so.
So that question, briefly, was in an era before social media. How did you get the word out about your actions? They had microphones.
Yeah, we didn't have microphones. There was a lot of capacity. People were, of course, it was first the Vietnam War and then the anti-nuke movement. So there were plenty of people to leaflet, and it was all over the community, downtown, neighborhoods, organizations. So I think that was the main way. It was just reaching out to people in either individually where they were outside, or going to organizations and institutions and with the information. The movement was really, it was well known too, I think. It was not quite like the Vietnam War, but people around the country were really concerned about this and eager to hear. And so invited people to come talk, and that's what I got, I guess. The media coverage wasn't half bad for a while. It got worse, but it got out that way too, to some degree. Well, how'd you get it out?
Well, I barraged every nurse I knew at work and in my union meetings. In the community I lived in, there were, I've been a big music appreciator for years, and so I would go to music events and stuff and leaflet. One of the things I used to do was go up to the Winnipeg Folk Festival every year, and I would have a bunch of leaflets and a bunch of information, because a lot of the people that went there were from Minnesota and from the United States. Also, showing up at city council meetings and churches, like I said, through the St. Joan of Arc, which I grew up Catholic, but I spoke at St. Stephen's. I got to know Paul Wellstone, and Marv and I and Richard spoke at his classes for a number of years, and just sort of at any opportunity, it's like people would say, "Well, what are you doing?" And I'm like, "You really want to know?" So there was that, and we formed committees which were called affinity groups, and each group would take on a certain task, and just telephoning and showing up, because we couldn't text. We had to physically show up, which is very different than it is now. So thank you.
I'm going to flag, if you do some digging, that video of Martin Sheen shivering in the cold on that night is available somewhere on the internet. I would highly recommend digging it up. Andrew, do you still have a question?
Yeah, I have two.
Yeah.
One minor one. Should I do them both at once or one at a time?
Do they go together?
Not really.
All right, let's do one at a time.
The first one is kind of a clarifying question, I guess. Sarah, you mentioned COINTELPRO being related in some way to the very first mass demonstration at Honeywell's headquarters. Were you implying that government agents of some kind were there to deliberately incite at the protest?
Yeah, so the question was for Sarah about COINTELPRO involvement at the mass demonstration.
That was proven through court documents for the Freedom of Information Act, which I don't know when that was available. Sometime in the 80s, you could get information through the Information Act, and the FBI files proved it. And the Honeywell Project was awarded $70,000. Most of that went overseas to buy shovels and pay people to go dig for the cluster bombs that were still there.
And Andrew, what was your second question? And then we'll go to the hand in the back.
My second question is about, you described these very large civil disobedience events with like thousands of people in some cases. So I've done civil disobedience
So that question's for Cindy and Sarah. How are you able to organize civil disobedience at such a large scale?
Yeah, there were meetings ahead of time. The plan, the organizers obviously developed the plan, and then there were many meetings where we would go and find out what the plan was. We'd make affinity groups, and when you heard Cindy talking about how she mapped the building, and it was really, well, just like ours now, kind of choreographed to the last detail. So. But there were a lot of meetings ahead of time, and it was never thousands. I think the most was 675 at one time. So, but that's still a lot, and yeah. The unexpected thing with that one is they put a fence up. Your dad. They put a fence up around Honeywell the day before, so we couldn't get there. So.
Yeah, there was I don't remember how tall it was. I think it was like 12 feet chain link fence around Honeywell. So my dad built a set of ladders that it telescoped into each other, and we there's a famous picture of Erica Boza on the top, going, we filed over the fences. It was really great. In fact, yesterday my neighbor and I took one of those ladders out of my garage and set it up in the backyard. And if anybody wants to see a picture of it, I have a picture of it on my phone. So I just couldn't lose it. It's in my garage. And it's very, very, very sturdy still. And that was built with my father's help up where he lived.
I've got.
We did have people going around like I would be a person who would make sure people were behaving themselves, so to speak, like we do now, and you wore the vests and that sort of thing. And one of the things that I did, which I didn't mention that I kept track of people who were arrested and where they were. Did you get out? Did they get out on time? Did they have transportation? In fact, a good friend of mine, Barbara Mishler, she never got out of jail one time. She was in the jail, and we were at the jail pounding on, where is she? Where, we don't know where she is and whatever. And it was around midnight, and we called Miles Lord, who is a judge. Does anybody know who he is? Well, that's another huge story. We called him and said, Barbara Mishler is missing, and about 45 minutes later, she walked out of the jail. Now, Miles Lord, mind you, was called the hanging judge in the 60s and 70s. He put draft dodgers in jail for as long as he could. Now, do I have time?
Yeah, go for it.
So my second time through college, I had what was work study with an organization called MPIRG, the Minnesota Public Interest Research Group, started by Ralph Nader, the Public Interest Research Group in every state. And I was doing research on a trial of the reserve mining from Silver Bay, Minnesota. Reserve mining was trying to pull out after they had built this town, a company town for miners, and they wanted to pull out. And Charlie, the Dayton Company, everybody knows the Daytons. Charlie Dayton was one of the lawyers in MPIRG, and Elliot Rothenberg, who later turned. Miles Lord happened to be the judge on the lawsuit that was filed by the Minnesota Public Interest Research Group against reserve mining. And about 2 years into the trial, he recused himself because he said he could not be objective to reserve mining because of all the evidence that was presented about how nasty these people were. So Miles Lord is the one who found John LaForge and Barb Cat innocent of pounding the nose cones at the Sperry Univac plant, were the nuclear power plant in Minneapolis. It was the nose cone for the nuclear warhead. And he was the federal judge for those two people, and he found them not guilty of destroying weapons. And he also later was, I got to know him, and he helped the Minnesota Nurses Association with free legal advice for our union. So there's somebody who throughout the years turned because of not specifically Honeywell Project, but other peace and justice stuff going on in the country.
In the Gale Family Library at the Historical Society, there's a lot of material about that fence, and there's a communication that Honeywell put out about the fence after they erected it, and the headline is, "We didn't want to build this fence." Amber, was yours a question or something to add? Sounds good, and then we'll go to you.
For those of you who aren't aware of this as a resource, and it looks like it's still online because our government doesn't bother to learn history. If you go to vault.fbi.gov and type in Honeywell, it looks like the FOIA is on there under New Left Minneapolis. So, and it's only 104 pages, which is pretty easy reading as far as the government goes.
Thank you so much. Let's go to the hand in the back. So the question's for Cindy, and it's about how you deal with infiltration and presence of undercover police in large meetings.
Well, there weren't cell phones and all that kind of stuff back then. So what we tried to do is say, know everybody. Know someone who comes in, befriend them, find out where they live, what their job is, and be really, really upfront. And I never, as far as I know, the Honeywell Project 2.0 didn't have any really true infiltrators. And you know, we were prepared for pretty much anything. So when people got arrested, and at one action, our observers who were lawyers were arrested, and that just happened, and we just dealt with it, and sort of. But as far as I know, nobody that I know in Honeywell Project 2.0 was an infiltrator. But it was because we were so careful to get to know any new person. So, thanks.
I see Christine, and then a hand up front. Christine.
Kind of going back to what Amber was saying, as well as like kind of just thinking about how we've organized in the past. What were the Honeywell employees' kind of reaction to how you were demonstrating, or like, I'm sure you leafleted them and let them know why you were there. But you know, like there's like the Climate Justice Committee talks to people who they're actively trying to get their company out of the neighborhoods. So I'm sure there's people who either appreciated
questions for Sarah and Cindy. How did Honeywell employees react to Honeywell Project actions?
Well, I think it was a mix. A lot of them, I actually knew they established a foundation to make themselves look better, and I actually had friends that went to work for that foundation, and so they knew what people were thinking, and many of them were sympathetic to what was going on, but they continued to work there. One guy by the name of Mark Paquette, who was an engineer early on, actually walked out of the company during a demonstration and resigned from doing the work he was doing. So he was greatly, yeah. But the executives did not take kindly to it. And,
No, yeah. I don't have anything to add, really.
Thank you. What's your question?
I have three if you want to interleave them or choose what to do first.
Let's go one by one.
What's that?
One by one.
Okay. As far as the the inertial guidance system, I noticed on the slides one was and civil, and you mentioned it's the only one. I know like inertial guidance systems, how they work, and I would think that there would be a lot of manufacturers of those, not necessarily just for the military, but those civil, civil situations like aircraft. Are there no other inertial guidance system manufacturers besides Honeywell?
The question's for Lena, and it's, are there no other inertial guidance, I already forgot the rest of it, producers aside from Honeywell?
So for the ARGM program in particular that Honeywell just received the contract for, I believe the IMU that the Minneapolis location is making is one that is no longer made commercially. So while not knowing the exact details, I would theorize that they have the manufacturing pieces to make that part. But for the other IMUs that Honeywell contributes to weapons, we just know that they are coming from Honeywell in particular. They do make other IMUs that are used in civilian aircrafts and other things besides armaments, but a significant amount are coming.
They would fit into the existing military, like the missiles and the bombs. Maybe that's the case.
Sorry, can you?
The particular part that Honeywell makes is only used in these, so they wouldn't be able to. Okay, I think you answered the question.
Yeah, maybe talk to me after.
Using inertial guidance, GPS goes down.
Oh yeah, there are other applications of the IMUs for sure, but sorry, I didn't mean to imply that the IMUs were only used in the specific weapons that they were used in, but they are using them.
What's your second question?
Mine?
Yes.
So I was wondering, comparing what you guys have gone through, people have gone through, compared to what we've seen the police and the brutality against both protesters as well as everyone else. Do you think it's worse, or have cops always been as violent and aggressive?
The question is for Cindy and Sarah. How does recent police repression in the Twin Cities compare to what you observed while you were organizing with the Honeywell Project?
Tony Boza was the police chief from 1980 to 1989. He was born in Spain. He came from Brooklyn. He was a police chief in Brooklyn, and he was hired to come here to clean up the police department here, Minneapolis Police Department. And he really tried hard. The cops hated him. But he did institute some really, really strict standards here. So we had Tony Boza for 9 years here. And he was very sympathetic. I got to know him and his wife over the years. They're both dead now. And just an incredibly brilliant a person who was very pragmatic but really supportive of nonviolent action. So another example, another story is on one of the big demonstrations, he would show up, and one time he left, and the cops just went kind of crazy. I mean, I saw cops picking up people by their hair and their pants and throwing them. a friend of mine was threatened to have her kids taken away from her, and it got pretty rough. Were you there? Yeah, it was kind of scary. So it all depended. I mean, there would be a rogue one that would go off, and if the media wasn't around, as soon as the media left, they would be very different. But I think Chicago in 1968 really turned the tide. As far as cops being more involved, but it just living through the invasion this past winter is really scary. Is really scary. So I don't know what to say. We had a very honeymoon kind of period there, even though there were some anarchist groups who threw bowling balls through Navy recruitment windows and did some of the things. I mean, there was kind of a split in the peace and justice community of how to do what was violence, what was permitted, what wasn't permitted. I mean, there was huge discussions about that was going on as well. So, but I think we were lucky.
Sarah, do you want to add anything?
The cops are the cops, and we know who they're there for, really. So, and Tony Boza was kind of a aberration. So it was gentler kind of policing, but he still represented, the system. So, but it made it easier for us, that's for sure.
I'm going to go to Ben in the back, and then we'll come back for your question, and then we'll get to Nick. Ben?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question, Alina, as well, because I was thinking, so about, am I correct, whether or not that IMU part can only be used in weapons, the $500 million contract they were just awarded is specifically to manufacture them to be used in missiles, right?
The question's for Lena. Is the IMU contract that the DOW just granted Honeywell in Minneapolis specifically to produce IMUs for use in weapons?
Yeah, just to clarify, the contract that went to the Minneapolis location was $30.8 million, and that was specifically for the IMU to be put into the ARGM ERs. And the $500 million is not exclusive to Minneapolis, but to other locations across the country, but specifically for Honeywell to make armaments for the Department of War.
But the $38 million is here.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Nick next, just to make sure everyone gets to ask a question. Nick?
Yeah, I had a question for Lena. With the IMUs that are being used, are those being put into the MQ-9 Reaper drones? Because the U.S. out of Africa is like building a campaign around the Reaper drones, because that's what's being used in Somalia and in Nigeria. And so I want to be able to say to people in the community, like, the stuff, there's a direct connection between the killing and local production.
Mm-hmm. So the questions for Lena are the Minneapolis-produced IMUs going into the Reaper drones being used in Somalia.
Yes, it's a little opaque, but you can kind of track it back to the fact that they use the H-764 EGIs that then use the state-of-the-art GG-1320s, which, like we saw, are produced in Minneapolis. I think there's a picture of that actually back over here, right there. But yeah, they're produced here.
Let's come back to the front. What's your third question?
Same question, different word, comparing then versus now. Instead of the police, the media. You even mentioned the media when they were present. Police might have behaved a little bit better. Well, right now, living in a fascist state, the media is compromised, except for independent media, arguably, and getting worse. That wasn't really the case in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I would think. Like, what are your observations and thoughts briefly on the media, the state of the media, and how that makes activism harder?
All right, that question's for Sarah and Cindy, and it's about comparing the media response and coverage in the 80s compared to now.
I think you're right. except when, national media comes to town and shows up at the church where the pastor was part of ICE. That was certainly an aberration too. I don't know. I don't know any media people. I've been out of the Honeywell Project loop for a while, working in my own community on different things, and so I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there's any media people that are sympathetic. I know there's a publication called MinPost. Anyone know that publication? They tend to be a little more radical, if I can even use that word. So I think you're right. I think it's different.
Well, I was just thinking with the, I'm not sure during Honeywell too, but certainly during the Vietnam War, the media became opposed to the war, kind of like they're opposed to Trump now and even the war in Iran. So there tends to be a little bit more coverage when that happens. Maybe kind of the same. They're the same.
I'm gonna
Again, their job is to, serve the state, not really.
I'm going to call on myself quickly. Listening to you talk about the transition between Honeywell 1.0 and 2.0, to what extent were members of Honeywell 1.0 engaged in organizing 2.0? To what extent was there organizational sustainability? Did it feel like a complete transformation, or were members very involved, and in what capacity?
I only know of two people who sort of transitioned. The Vietnam War changed a lot of people, and I think it seems to me that the people involved in the early Honeywell were younger, and people move on. People graduate from college, have kids, move out of state, and so even though there were many people in their 40s and 50s who were involved in the Honeywell Project 2.0, it seemed like they were different people in my experience.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to call on Ben. The question is for Amber, and Ben's asking about, in your experience in the Navy, did you observe or hear about anything similar to what appears to be happening on the Abraham Lincoln right now?
Are you referring to the possible riot or the suicidal ideations?
I mean, just I guess just the gestalt of something like that coming out in the media, where it's ordinary civilians are hearing about this incident. Is that sort of something that's happened before?
Okay, I'm going to touch on both then.
Yeah.
So there has not been a publicized riot since the Vietnam War era. I cannot remember which year it happened. It absolutely was because of racial tension aboard one of the carriers that was deployed to, I believe, the South China Sea. It was pretty significant. A lot of people got injured. Nobody died. And it made the media because, it really disrupted the ship operations, much like the Ford lighting itself on fire. I think now 5 months ago that happened, and they tried to keep chugging along with that, but when you are minus 600 beds on an already crowded, and it's weird to say that an aircraft carrier is crowded, but it can get that way. If you're minus 600 beds, again, you have very unhappy people. As far as the suicidal ideations, absolutely. That is incredibly common. I experienced it myself on deployment out in the middle of the ocean, and what I put on my social media yesterday, and I'm still thinking through for like longer video explanation, is it is a level of exhaustion and desperation that is very hard to explain, and like an understanding by people that the government literally owns your body. You're not going home without being dead or seriously maimed. And so that, and it's a hard thing to talk about, right? In the overall scheme of what is happening in the catastrophic events that are being carried out by these people on the ship, whether they're directly or indirectly participating. But I think that it's a huge sticking point that is worthwhile when you are talking with people who may be like anti-Trump or war on Iran, but if Biden had done it, they'd be perfectly fine with it. These are things that remain common. Is it worth it for this sort of destruction to be done on people that you think that you're honoring? And then move to the next step. So it's an opportunity to use it. So, did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. The Navy's wild, y'all.
We're going to take one more hand before we wrap up.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's to you, my dear. Back in the early days, the cluster bomb was really easy to explain, and even the guidance equipment for the Pershing and cruise missiles were pretty easy to explain. I'm having trouble. I really want to go out in the community and say, "What the fuck is this?" And I'm a little lost. So can you speak to that, please?
That's a great question and a concern that I had. I think that in putting together the slide deck, what I notice, and I think the easiest way to explain it to just everyday people, is that, especially in the rise of AI being used in dystopian ways, I think that the notion of a self-guided missile or a precision missile or an unmanned vehicle used to kill people is pretty frightening, and the IMUs are the pieces that allow that to happen, because without them, the missile cannot orient itself or guide itself. And I appreciate all of you here listening to all this collectively for the first time, and I would appreciate hearing any of your questions after this as well. But I think that is probably the clearest way to do it, or also just talking about the weapons themselves, because I think that is also very clear. That the JDAMs that are being used, the Hellfire missiles being used, they depend on these IMUs. And so when we see the devastation that they wrought in, just around the world, we can clearly say, like, hey, you hate MQ-9 Reaper drones? We hate that stuff, right? Why is Honeywell making the IMUs for them? And so I think connecting to the things that people can see and understand is important, because Honeywell here is just a node in the supply chain. And that's okay. Maybe people don't need to understand the technical details of IMUs.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I'm going to say, if you have more questions for our panelists, you are welcome to either talk to them after, or if they have to go, reach out through MPAC. We'll figure out a way for you to do that. I'm going to run through upcoming events. This is a Minnesota Peace Action Coalition action. There is another of those happening this Saturday at 1 p.m. at Mayday Plaza. That's going to be a U.S. out of Korea rally. Sarah Martin is a long-term member of Women Against Military Madness. WAMM has a weekly vigil at Summit and Snelling at 4 p.m. every Friday. I believe that's been going on for over 2 decades. Is that right? So please show up to that. In this room at this same time next Thursday, the Anti-War Committee will be hosting a panel on Palantir. We're going to have some great speakers, including a speaker who organized a nurses union in New York to get Palantir out of their hospital. And then you heard a little bit about COINTELPRO and infiltration of organizations. There's been a lot of news coming out today specifically about orgs getting infiltrated in the Twin Cities. The People's Action Coalition Against Trump is hosting a FOIA for the 15, a Freedom of Information Access request, kind of like teach-in workshop. That's going to be Monday, 6 p.m. at the New City Center. I hope to see many of you there. I hope to see many of you in a potential Honeywell Project 3.0. And can we get one more round of applause for our speakers today?